The handcuffs closed around Brennan Vale's wrists in the middle of the courthouse parking lot. Sheriff Marceline Cross looked at him with a cold, practiced stare, then raised her voice so the small crowd gathering near the steps could hear every word. "A single father who thinks he stands above the law," she said, "is exactly the kind of man this county does not need." Brennan did not resist. He did not raise his voice, did not pull away, did not offer a single word in his own defense. He simply looked at her. The way a man looks at a storm he has already calculated the path of. Behind him, his grown daughter stood frozen, watching a woman with a badge dismantle her father's dignity in front of strangers. And she said nothing either, because something in his eyes had told her not to. Marceline ordered her deputies to search his car, to empty his pockets, to take his phone. She wanted an audience, and she wanted a headline. The kind of morning that reminded Blackridge County who really ran it. But when a small leather case was pulled from the inside of his jacket and opened on the hood of the cruiser, revealing a badge stamped with 3 letters that made every deputy nearby go quiet, her expression changed in less than a second. Brennan Vale was not a suspect standing outside a courthouse. He was a federal agent standing inside the middle of an investigation, and the woman who had just humiliated him in public was one of the names written inside the file she had not yet been allowed to read. The morning had started ordinary enough, cold and gray over the Blackridge County Courthouse. The kind of light that made every building look older than it was. Brennan Vale walked out of a side door after a routine civil hearing. Dressed the way he always dressed when he wanted to be forgotten the moment someone looked away. Plain jacket, plain boots, nothing that suggested he carried federal credentials in his coat. His sedan was parked near the end of the lot, unremarkable. Dust settled on the hood from a week of quiet driving. He was 3 steps from the driver's door when the lights of a patrol cruiser swept across the pavement, and a voice ordered him to stop where he stood. Marceline stepped out of the cruiser first, moving the way people move when they have spent 11 years being obeyed without question. She asked for his identification, and Brennan handed it over without hesitation, calm in a way that unsettled her more than resistance would have. He asked, simply and evenly, what exactly he was being stopped for. And she did not answer directly, because there was no answer that would hold up. Only the vague shape of suspicion she had decided to act on. She told him he looked like the kind of man worth a second look. And Alara, standing near the courthouse steps, felt her stomach tighten as she watched a stranger with a badge decide her father's fate on instinct alone. Marceline raised her voice deliberately, wanting the small crowd near the entrance to hear her, wanting witnesses to a performance she had given before. "Some people think being a single father gives them special privileges," she said, loud enough to carry, and Brennan did not flinch at the insult, did not reach for anger the way most people would have. He answered quietly instead, saying he did not need privileges, only for her to follow procedure, and something about the steadiness of his voice landed like a slap she had not expected. It was a small sentence, but it exposed the gap between what she was doing and what the law actually allowed her to do, and she did not like being reminded of that gap in front of an audience. She ordered the trunk opened, partly out of authority and partly out of a need to prove her instincts right in front of the people watching. Brennan could have stopped her there, could have cited the exact statute that made the search unlawful without probable cause. And later, when people asked him why he hadn't, he would say only that he needed to see how far she would go on her own. Inside the trunk sat a single black case, plain and unmarked. And when Marceline pulled it open, she found not weapons or drugs but a folder, its cover stamped with a warning that made her hand pause mid-motion. Blackridge County. Confidential, the letters read. And for the first time that morning, the certainty on her face cracked just slightly at the edges. Marceline demanded an explanation for the folder, her voice sharper now, the crowd behind her no longer a stage but a witness to something she could not immediately control. Brennan told her, evenly, that it was simply work material, nothing more, and the vagueness of the answer did the opposite of calming her. It deepened the suspicion already forming behind her eyes. Dorian Pike arrived moments later, the undersheriff and her closest confidant for over a decade, and the instant he saw Brennan's face, something flickered across his own that Marceline did not catch, but that Brennan absolutely did. Dorian murmured that he recognized the man, that he had seen him near several sensitive locations around the county in recent weeks, and that single observation was enough to convince Marceline she had stumbled onto something larger than a routine stop. She demanded his phone next, and this time Brennan refused, calm but immovable, and Marceline turned that refusal into exactly the narrative she wanted, framing simple silence as open defiance against law enforcement. She ordered the cuffs, and Brennan offered his wrists without a struggle, without a raised voice, without the panic that innocent men are supposed to display according to the scripts television had taught everyone to expect. Phones came out among the small crowd, recording the scene from a dozen angles, capturing a sheriff's department pinning a quiet man against a patrol car for the crime of asking what statute justified her actions. Alara took a step forward instinctively, the way any daughter would, but Brennan caught her eye and shook his head once, a small motion that told her more clearly than words ever could that this moment was already under control, just not the kind of control anyone standing in that parking lot could see. What Marceline read as arrogance was in fact something closer to observation, the practiced stillness of a man who had spent years learning to watch a room instead of react to it. As the deputies moved him toward the cruiser, Brennan's eyes tracked exactly who gave which order, who obeyed without question, who reached instinctively for their own phone, who seemed to be quietly deleting something instead. He noted which faces looked uncomfortable and which looked satisfied, because in his line of work, discomfort in the wrong people at the wrong moment often told him more than any confession ever could. It was not fear that kept him quiet in the back of that cruiser. It was patience. The same patience that had carried him through 18 months of work, that had led, almost inevitably, to this exact parking lot on this exact morning. Just before the door closed, Brennan caught a fragment of conversation that confirmed everything he had suspected walking into Blackridge weeks earlier. Dorian had stepped a few feet away, phone pressed to his ear, murmuring low enough that he assumed no one could hear him over the noise of the crowd. "He's here," Dorian said, "just like we expected," and Brennan, cuffed and silent in the back seat, allowed himself the smallest, faintest smile, because a man who says "just like we expected" has already revealed that he was expecting something to begin with. Inside the interrogation room, the fluorescent light buzzing low over a metal table, Marceline sat across from him and began the questions she had rehearsed 100 times with other suspects who had folded long before this point. Why had he come to Blackridge? Why had he been seen repeatedly near the sheriff's department? Who did he work for? And what exactly justified a folder stamped confidential sitting in the trunk of an unmarked sedan? Brennan answered in short sentences, offering only what was necessary, nothing that would give her leverage, nothing that would let her build a story faster than the truth could catch up to it. When she asked where he had been staying during his time in the county, he gave her a street name and nothing more. When she asked who might vouch for his presence there, he told her that was a question for people with the proper clearance to ask it. Each answer was true, precise, and utterly useless to her as a weapon, which frustrated her far more than an outright lie would have, because a lie could at least be caught and used against him. Marceline leaned forward, using the tone she reserved for people she believed she already owned, telling him he had walked into her county thinking no one would notice a stranger circling too close for too long. Brennan looked at her for a long moment before answering, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the defensiveness she had expected from a guilty man. "I was counting on someone noticing," he said, and the air in the room shifted, subtle but unmistakable. The way a room changes when someone says something true instead of something convenient. Marceline felt the first genuine flicker of unease she had experienced all morning, though she pushed it down and pressed forward, instead of pausing to examine it. Brennan began asking his own questions in return, calm and methodical, inquiring about chain of custody procedures, about whether the interrogation room's cameras were currently recording, about who exactly had signed off on the search warrant that technically did not exist. Every question he asked was procedural, precise, the kind of question only someone deeply familiar with the machinery of law enforcement would think to ask under pressure. Marceline began to realize, slowly and with growing discomfort, that the man across the table understood the legal system with a fluency that had nothing to do with luck or television dramas. Still, Pride kept her moving forward, unwilling to admit in front of her own deputies that the ground beneath the morning's certainty had begun, ever so slightly, to shift. Elsewhere in the building, a young records clerk named Mara Quinn noticed something in Brennan's intake file that did not match the routine arrests she processed on any given week, a series of small irregularities that pricked at her attention like a splinter she could not quite locate. She had noticed, first, that the arrest report listed no prior record at all, not even a minor infraction, which was unusual for someone accused of behaving suspiciously enough to warrant a full search. Then, she noticed the timestamp discrepancy, a gap of nearly 11 minutes between when the vehicle was flagged and when the official stop was logged, a gap that should not have existed under normal procedure. Mara had worked in that office long enough to recognize the difference between a routine irregularity and something deliberately smoothed over, and this felt unmistakably like the second kind. She glanced toward the hallway leading to the interrogation rooms, weighing whether to mention what she had seen to anyone, and decided for the moment to keep watching instead. Mara pulled up the department's internal system out of simple curiosity, typing Brennan's name into a search field she had used 1,000 times before without incident. A red warning bloomed across her screen almost instantly. Federal restricted access, the kind of alert she had never once seen in 3 years working behind that desk. Her hand moved to close the window before anyone walked past and noticed what she was looking at, her pulse quickening with the particular fear of someone who has just glimpsed something they were never meant to see. She sat still for a moment afterward, staring at the blank screen, understanding without being told that whatever was happening in that interrogation room down the hall was far larger than a single traffic stop gone strange. Back in her office, Marceline finally made the call she had been avoiding, dialing District Attorney Silas Mercer, a man whose calm voice had guided her through a dozen difficult cases over the years. The moment she said Brennan's name aloud, something changed on the other end of the line, a pause too long to be casual, a silence that told her more than any words could have. Silas asked, carefully, whether she had taken his phone, and when she confirmed that she had, he asked a second question with even more weight behind it, whether she had opened it. Marceline said she had not, and Silas exhaled audibly before instructing her, in a voice stripped of its usual warmth, to do absolutely nothing further until he arrived. No searches, no calls, no movement of any kind. The instruction unsettled her more than anything Brennan himself had said, because Silas Mercer did not panic, not over paperwork, not over routine arrests, not over anything she had witnessed in years of working alongside him. She sat with the receiver still in her hand, turning over the same question again and again, wondering what kind of ordinary man could make a district attorney's voice shake with that particular caution. When she returned to the interrogation room, Brennan was watching the camera mounted in the corner with an expression of quiet patience, as though he were waiting for a scene he already knew the ending to. "You should probably check who's watching you," he said, and Marceline felt something cold settle low in her stomach, a feeling she would later recognize as the first true instinct of fear she had experienced in over a decade, wearing that badge. She demanded to know what he meant by the comment, but Brennan simply turned the question back on her instead of answering directly, asking how long she had served as sheriff. 11 years, she answered, almost reflexively. And he followed with a second question, quieter but far heavier, asking how many times in those 11 years she had actually investigated her own department. The question landed like a blow, and Marceline's composure cracked for the first time since the parking lot, anger rising fast to cover the unease spreading underneath it. What she did not yet understand was that Brennan had not come to Blackridge chasing her specifically, that her name was only one thread inside a much larger and older investigation into corruption running through the county's institutions, and that she was, in the language of his work, simply a piece of a pattern far bigger than herself. Brennan lifted his eyes to the small camera mounted above the door and spoke directly into it, his voice calm and deliberate, carrying none of the strain a man under arrest was supposed to display. "Agent Vale," he said, "you can come in now." And Marceline felt every certainty she had built that morning collapse at once, because she had never once spoken his name aloud to anyone outside that room. The door opened seconds later, and Special Agent Gideon Rusk walked in flanked by 2 additional federal agents, their presence changing the entire temperature of the space in an instant. Gideon placed a set of authorization documents on the table without a word, letting the paper speak before he did, and Marceline's eyes moved across the federal seal with a dawning understanding that her morning had gone catastrophically wrong. Brennan rose from his chair slowly, reaching into the inside of his jacket and drawing out a worn leather case, opening it with a motion so practiced it barely registered as deliberate. Inside sat a federal badge, its metal catching the fluorescent light, and Marceline stared at it the way a person stares at a diagnosis they had been dreading without naming. "Special Agent Brennan Vale," he said simply, his voice as even as it had been in the parking lot hours earlier. No triumph in it, no cruelty, only fact. Marceline understood in that instant that the arrest she had orchestrated with such confidence in front of a crowd of witnesses had just become potential evidence in a federal case, and that every word she had spoken that morning had been recorded by cameras she had never thought to question. Gideon explained, with the flat efficiency of a man delivering information he had rehearsed many times before, that Brennan had been working undercover in Blackridge for the better part of 18 months. The target of the investigation was not a single officer but an entire network, one built quietly over years inside the county's own law enforcement and legal institutions, a structure the Bureau had labeled internally as the Blackridge Public Corruption Network. The list of suspected offenses was long and precise: corruption, falsified records, protection arrangements, shielding certain individuals from prosecution, leaked details from active investigations, and evidence quietly altered or misplaced before it could reach a courtroom. Marceline listened to each item with a growing sense that the ground she had stood on for 11 years had never been as solid as she believed. She had walked into that morning convinced she was humiliating an ordinary man in front of his own daughter, asserting authority the way she had asserted it 100 times before without consequence. Instead, she had exposed, in vivid and recorded detail, exactly how she used her position when she believed no one with real power was watching her do it. Gideon instructed that every body camera and dash camera from the incident be sealed immediately as evidence, because there was nothing left to object to. Brennan did not gloat, did not raise his voice, did not offer the satisfaction of a man enjoying a reversal of fortune, saying only that he had given her every chance to stop before things went this far. Gideon opened a second folder, thicker than the first, and turned it so that the top page faced Marceline directly across the table. Her own name sat printed at the top in plain black letters, Marceline Cross, beneath a case number she did not recognize, and a date that predated the morning's arrest by several weeks. She stared at the page as though willing the letters to rearrange themselves into something less damning, but the words held their shape no matter how long she looked. For the first time since she had put on the badge 11 years earlier, Marceline Cross understood, fully and without illusion, that she was no longer the one asking the questions in that room. She denied it immediately, insisting the file had to be fabricated, that no evidence existed connecting her to anything beyond doing her job the way she always had. Brennan did not argue with her, did not raise his voice to counter her denial, simply nodding to Gideon, who pressed a button and let a recording fill the silence of the room instead. The audio captured conversations between Marceline, Dorian, and Silas, exchanges laced with the careful, coded language of people used to speaking around the truth rather than through it, suggestive but not yet conclusive on its own. Brennan let the recording finish before speaking again, his voice quiet but absolutely certain, explaining that this was precisely why he had allowed her to arrest him in the first place. Marceline felt the full shape of the trap settle over her at last, understanding that the entire humiliating scene in the parking lot had never been an accident of bad timing but a carefully engineered test. Brennan had wanted to see exactly who would be called, who would demand cameras be erased, who would move quickly to reach for his phone or his file before anyone official arrived. Dorian, watching events unfold from another part of the building, felt the first genuine tremor of panic since the morning began, and made a call to someone outside the department, believing the line was still safe. It was not. And the recording of that call would become one more thread, pulling the entire structure of Blackridge's quiet corruption closer to collapse. Outside the building, Alara waited by the courthouse steps, her presence brief and peripheral to the events unfolding inside. a daughter standing at the edge of a storm she did not fully understand yet. Brennan found a moment to step outside and speak with her directly, his voice softening in a way it had not once during the hours inside that interrogation room. "Go home," he told her gently. "I've got this." And Alara studied her father's face for a long moment before nodding, trusting the calm she had known her entire life. Even when she could not see the reasons behind it, she left without further questions, because she had learned long ago that her father's silences carried more truth than most people's explanations ever could. Meanwhile, Dorian moved through the department with growing urgency, retreating to a locked cabinet in a back office that few employees even knew existed. Inside sat dozens of files accumulated over years. Quiet records of favors granted, cases redirected, and evidence that had simply disappeared before trial, when it proved inconvenient to certain people. Near the top of the stack sat a folder freshly labeled, the ink barely dry, bearing a name that made Dorian's hands go still against the metal drawer. Brennan Vale, FBI, the letters read, and Dorian understood in that instant that whatever careful architecture he and his allies had built over the years had already begun to come apart at the seams. Marceline did not surrender easily, not at first, calling in legal counsel and leaning on every ounce of authority still available to her, despite the mounting evidence stacked against her name. She began framing the entire situation publicly as a case of federal overreach trampling local authority, insisting that Brennan had operated illegally within her county without proper notification or oversight. She gave a short statement outside the courthouse steps, her voice steady and rehearsed, telling the small group of reporters gathered there that the people of Blackridge deserved to know when outsiders were operating in their community without transparency. She avoided any mention of the confidential folder, the interrogation room, or the recording that had already begun circulating quietly among federal attorneys preparing the case. It was a careful performance, built on the same instincts that had made her sheriff in the first place, the ability to control a room simply by speaking first and speaking with certainty. For a few days, the strategy appeared to work, at least on the surface, as local commentary shifted toward questions about federal jurisdiction rather than her own conduct that morning. Letters appeared in the county paper defending her record. Longtime residents, recalling the years she had spent responding to emergencies, presiding over community events, standing at the front of funerals for officers lost in the line of duty. It was, in its own way, a testament to how effectively reputation can outrun evidence, at least for a little while, before the weight of documented fact finally catches up. It was a narrative crafted to appeal to a particular kind of resentment, the sense that outsiders with federal badges believed themselves entitled to walk into small communities and dictate terms. Some residents, hearing only the surface of her account, began to rally around her, unaware of the recordings and files quietly building against her inside a federal case file. The situation opened into a genuine and uncomfortable question that spread through the community in low, uncertain conversations at diners and gas stations across Blackridge County. How far should a sheriff's authority extend? And at what point does an undercover federal investigation cross from necessary oversight into something closer to entrapment of the people meant to enforce the law? Brennan, watching the public conversation unfold from a distance, made clear to Gideon and the rest of the team that he had no interest in turning the case into a personal campaign against Marceline specifically. "This isn't about humiliating her," he said quietly, and when Gideon asked what it was about instead, Brennan answered with the sentence that would come to define the entire case in the minds of everyone who eventually heard it: making sure nobody else gets humiliated by the badge she wears. New evidence surfaced not long after, drawn from hallway security footage inside the courthouse itself, footage that painted a far more damning picture than any audio recording had managed alone. The timestamps proved that Marceline had received information suggesting Brennan's true identity minutes before the arrest in the parking lot, information she had chosen to ignore or dismiss in the moment. It confirmed what Gideon had suspected from the beginning, that the humiliation in front of the crowd had not been an honest mistake born of aggressive policing, but a calculated display of dominance made in full or near full awareness of who she was dealing with. The footage showed Dorian leaning close to Marceline's ear only 90 seconds before the handcuffs came out, his lips forming words the microphone had not caught, but his posture unmistakable, urgent and deliberate, rather than casual. Whatever he told her in that moment had not slowed her down, had not made her pause even briefly to reconsider the situation unfolding in front of dozens of witnesses. If anything, the footage suggested the opposite, that she had accelerated the arrest immediately afterward, as though eager to finish something before anyone could stop her from finishing it. The footage would become one of the most damaging pieces of evidence in the entire case, because it stripped away any possibility of claiming ignorance as a defense. Brennan sat with Gideon late one evening, reconstructing the sequence of events methodically, laying each of Marceline's actions beside the evidence that either supported or contradicted her account. There was no need for raised voices in that reconstruction, no need for theatrical confrontation, only the quiet, patient weight of evidence measured against power, one fact placed carefully after another. Mara Quinn, the young records clerk who had first noticed the restricted access warning, became an unexpectedly crucial witness as the investigation deepened around her. She confirmed, hesitantly at first, and then with growing resolve, that Marceline had on several occasions instructed staff not to formally record certain meetings, to alter portions of official reports, and to keep specific files out of the department's primary system entirely. Mara's hands trembled as she gave her statement, fully aware of what it might cost her within a department she still had to work inside, but she chose honesty over the comfortable silence that had protected people above her for years. Marceline, confronted directly with Mara's account, lost her composure for the first time since the ordeal had begun days earlier, her voice cracking with something closer to genuine confusion than anger. "Why didn't you tell me who you were?" she asked Brennan, the question carrying real weight beneath its simplicity, as though identity alone might have changed everything that followed. Brennan's answer came without hesitation, delivered in the same calm, level voice he had used since the very first moment in that parking lot, because ordinary people don't get to reveal their identity before you decide how you'll treat them. The sentence settled over the room like something final, a verdict delivered not by a judge, but by a man who had simply refused to be anyone other than himself throughout the entire ordeal. Marceline sat with that sentence for a long time afterward. Long after the room had emptied and the recording equipment had been switched off, turning the words over the way a person turns over a stone, looking for what lives underneath it. She thought back over 11 years of stops made on instinct, of drivers questioned because something about their car or their posture had struck her as wrong, of the dozens of small moments where she had decided, alone and without evidence, who deserved suspicion and who did not. Not all of those decisions had been unfair, she told herself, but she could no longer pretend that all of them had been fair either, and that uncertainty was its own kind of verdict. Gideon, watching from the doorway, gave her the space to sit with that realization without pushing further, understanding that some lessons land harder when no one forces them. In the days that followed, the investigation accelerated sharply, pulling in threads that had remained hidden for years beneath the surface of Blackridge's quiet, orderly reputation. Silas Mercer disappeared from his office without warning, his phone left behind on his desk, powered off, deliberately or otherwise abandoning the very evidence that might have explained his sudden absence. Far more alarming to the federal team, however, was the second disappearance that followed almost immediately after, because the person nowhere to be found was not Silas, but Dorian Pike. Agents combing through months of financial records, communications, and internal department documents began to see the true shape of the network for the first time, and it was far larger than Marceline alone. Dorian, not Marceline, had been the one quietly directing much of the network's daily operations, using his position as undersheriff to shield certain transactions and redirect uncomfortable questions before they reached anyone capable of asking them properly. Silas had functioned as the legal architecture behind the arrangement, the one who made illegal decisions appear procedurally sound on paper, lending legitimacy to things that deserved none. Marceline herself had been involved, certainly, complicit in ways that would follow her for the rest of her career, but she had also, gradually and almost imperceptibly, become someone controlled by the very network she believed she commanded. The final piece of evidence arrived in the form of an old recording Gideon's team recovered from a device seized during the investigation, a conversation between Dorian and an unnamed associate months before Brennan had ever set foot in Blackridge. "The sheriff isn't the one we need to worry about," Dorian's voice said clearly on the recording. And the sentence that followed named the person he genuinely feared, a name that was not Marceline's at all, but Brennan's. Dorian, realizing federal attention had shifted decisively toward him, attempted to leave the county quietly under the cover of an early morning departure, hoping to disappear before charges could formally reach him. Federal agents intercepted him in a parking lot not unlike the one where the entire story had begun, the symmetry of the location entirely intentional on Gideon's part. There was no dramatic struggle when they took him, no chase through the streets of Blackridge, only the same quiet tension that had defined the rest of the investigation from its opening moments. Dorian looked at Brennan across the open space between them, his expression somewhere between disbelief and grudging recognition of a plan executed with patience he had never anticipated from a man he had once dismissed as ordinary. "You planned all of this," he said, and Brennan shook his head slightly, correcting the assumption with the same calm precision he had used throughout the entire case. "No," Brennan answered. "You did. I just gave you enough room to reveal it." The morning Dorian was taken into custody, the county seemed unusually quiet, as though the whole town understood something significant had shifted even before the official announcement reached the local paper. Deputies who had worked under him for years moved through their shifts in near silence, unsure how much of what they had built their careers on now stood on unstable ground. Some of them would later speak of a strange relief beneath the discomfort, the sense that a weight they had not fully named until it lifted had finally been taken off the department's shoulders. Others simply kept their heads down, waiting to see how far the investigation would ultimately reach before deciding whether their own conduct might one day be examined as closely. Marceline, watching the final arrests unfold from a distance, removed her badge before anyone asked her to, setting it down on her desk with a stillness that suggested the gesture carried more weight than any formal suspension could have. She looked at Brennan across the room. Stripped now of the authority that had once let her dictate the terms of every conversation she entered. "Was I really that bad?" she asked quietly, and there was no performance left in the question, only something close to honest uncertainty about who she had become over 11 years wearing that badge. Brennan did not answer with cruelty, and he did not offer easy comfort either, choosing instead the plain, difficult truth, telling her simply that she had forgotten what the badge was actually for. Marceline turned back toward the empty sheriff's chair sitting behind her now vacant desk, staring at it the way a person stares at an object that suddenly looks unfamiliar despite years of use. For the first time, in over a decade, she understood that the power she had believed belonged to her personally had never truly been hers to keep, that it had always been a responsibility on loan, contingent on how carefully and honestly she chose to carry it. The investigation formally concluded not long after, its outcomes rippling through Blackridge County in ways that would take years to fully settle. Dorian faced federal charges tied directly to years of documented corruption, evidence far too extensive and well-organized for any lawyer to argue away easily. Silas Mercer, eventually located and brought in for questioning, faced prosecution of his own, the legal architecture he had spent years constructing, collapsing under the weight of records he had never expected anyone to examine so closely. Marceline underwent a formal internal investigation into her own conduct. Her career and her future left uncertain in a way that 11 years of steady authority had never once prepared her to face. She cooperated fully with investigators once the initial denial had burned itself out, offering testimony that helped close several gaps the federal team had not yet managed to fill on their own. It did not erase what she had done, and she never expected it to. But it marked, at least, the beginning of an honesty she had avoided for longer than she cared to admit even to herself. Mara Quinn, the young clerk whose quiet observation had first cracked the surface of the case, received formal protection as a cooperating witness, her honesty ultimately proving more valuable to the investigation than any single piece of physical evidence. In the quiet aftermath, the county itself seemed to exhale, the way a town does after discovering that the institutions meant to protect it had, for years, been protecting something else entirely. Brennan returned to an ordinary life not long after the case closed, the kind of quiet existence that stood in sharp contrast to the drama that had unfolded across those difficult weeks. There were no patrol cars trailing him through town, no federal badge displayed for anyone to see, no reminders scattered through his days of the authority he carried when the work required it. He returned to the same modest house he had lived in before the assignment began, its rooms simple and unremarkable, exactly the way he preferred them to remain. Brennan had never been the kind of man who sought recognition for the work he did, and those closest to him understood that this quality was not modesty performed for effect, but something closer to genuine indifference toward the spotlight. He was, above everything else the case had revealed about him, a single father who had spent years learning to set his own reputation aside whenever protecting someone else required it. Neighbors who had watched the news coverage with growing recognition sometimes stopped him at the mailbox or in the grocery store, unsure whether to treat him as a stranger or as the quiet man who had lived down the street for years without drawing attention to himself. Brennan handled these moments the same way he handled almost everything, with a brief nod, a short answer, and a gentle redirection back toward the ordinary business of the day. He had no interest in becoming a local symbol of anything, no appetite for the kind of recognition that followed men who chased headlines rather than results. What mattered to him instead was smaller and steadier, the quiet rhythm of making dinner, checking in with Alara, sleeping through a night without waiting for a phone call that meant the operation had gone wrong. Those ordinary comforts, invisible to anyone who did not know what he had spent the past 18 months doing, meant more to him than any commendation the Bureau might eventually offer. Alara, sitting across from him one evening in the quiet of their kitchen, asked the question that had lingered with her since that first cold morning outside the courthouse. "You knew she was going to treat you like that," she said. And Brennan answered simply that he had suspected it might happen, though he had not been entirely certain. "And you still let her," Alara pressed, watching her father's face carefully for the answer beneath the answer. The reasoning he rarely explained even to her. "Sometimes the truth only comes out," he told her gently, "when people believe nobody is watching them at all." Brennan placed his federal badge on the table between them that evening, not as a trophy marking a victory won, but as something closer to a quiet reminder of the cost such victories carried. He looked out the kitchen window at the ordinary street beyond it. Cars passing, neighbors walking dogs. The entire unremarkable rhythm of a life that had briefly been interrupted by something far larger than itself. Life in Blackridge slowly returned to its normal pace, the courthouse resuming its usual business, the sheriff's department beginning the long, uncomfortable process of rebuilding trust that had been quietly eroded for years before anyone noticed. Brennan, for his part, wanted none of the attention that followed a case of this size, choosing instead to fade back into the same ordinary rhythm he had always preferred. Several weeks later, Brennan returned to the same courthouse where the entire story had begun, walking through its doors for a task as small and unremarkable as paying an overdue parking fine. A new employee behind the counter recognized his face from news coverage of the case and straightened slightly, clearly uncertain how to address a man whose name had recently appeared in federal headlines across the region. Brennan only smiled, offering nothing dramatic, no reference to badges or investigations, or the weight of everything that had unfolded within those same walls weeks earlier. "I'm just here to pay a parking ticket," he said simply, and something in the plainness of the moment settled the tension immediately, turning what could have been an awkward encounter into something almost gently funny. The air around him felt lighter after months defined by suspicion, evidence, and the slow unraveling of people who had mistaken power for permanence. Brennan walked out of the courthouse that afternoon, the same way he had walked into it months earlier, unremarkable in appearance, unhurried in pace, carrying nothing that announced who he truly was to anyone who happened to glance his way. No one in that parking lot looked at him as a weak or ordinary man any longer, though very few of them understood exactly why that perception had shifted so completely. But the truth, Brennan carried quietly, the truth that had defined him long before Blackridge and would continue defining him long after, was simple enough that he never needed anyone else to say it aloud for him. He had never once needed the world to see him differently in order to know exactly who he was.